So Turn the Page generally looks at books that we all wish we read sooner to help us have more successful careers. But your career and what you do in business really is a means to an end, and that end is to have a better life. So when it comes to living a better life as a parent, as a spouse, as a human being, The Algebra of Happiness is a book you should read ASAP. Scott Galloway is a professor at NYU. He's a former entrepreneur. He does a podcast with Kara Swisher, and his previous book, The Four, takes a look at what the four horsemen of big tech platforms do and share in common that kind of explain their dominance. But that's not the book that I actually want to talk about, because that kind of book is a subject matter that I've covered and basically operate in all my life. But I found this book, The Algebra of Happiness, to be the kind of book that a parent would give their son or daughter as they are completing their college studies and about to embark as young professionals in their career. So why? Why is this book so insightful? I'll be candid and say that the book is written very, very simply and in almost a stream of consciousness kind of way, which is not a knock. It's just to show that it's a very sincere and candid and rapid fire style that basically takes you through about 10 to 20 lessons that Scott has learned throughout his career as a son, as an entrepreneur, as a human being, as a spouse and significant other, as a business person, as a journalist, and mainly all galvanized through his careers as a teacher at NYU Stern. Similarly, this video is going to be a bit more stream of consciousness because there's about 10 ideas that I'm going to jump from one to another, and each one are going to maybe be more or less pertinent depending on where you are in your life. The overarching idea that I liked quite a bit was how in your early 20s, you're happy because your needs and your priorities are pretty simple. Then in your 30s and your 40s, you start to worry about the pressures that you need to face with your career. You maybe eventually, start dating, and then you maybe get married, you have kids, and you start to worry about the school you send your kids, the mortgages, and in Scott's words, you become miserable. Until your late 40s and early 50s, when again, you kind of start to see the forest through the trees and you become happy again. Now, I mentioned this is a good book to read around the time you're finishing your studies before you venture out in your career. That manifests itself in two ways in this book. First off, Scott's pretty right that while not critical, the first 5 years of your career are going to impact your earning power the rest of your life. Second, it's not just what you study in school, it's more where you decide to live. If you decide to make some sacrifices and live in, say, New York City or London versus living in St. Louis, then that is going to set you on a path in terms of your earning power. It may not necessarily lead you to have a better quality of life, but it will absolutely precisely determine how much money you're going to make when you're 30, 40, 50, and so on. Now granted, some people like Sam Walton, who founded Walmart, did so late in their career. Warren Buffett went on to make 80% of his massive wealth late into his career as an investor. But by and large, those are the exceptions. And speaking of exceptions, he comes out guns blazing and says, stop this idea that, Mark Zuckerberg did this or Bill Gates did that by dropping out of school. I love his line that by and large, you should assume that you are not going to be Mark Zuckerberg and just be a bit more realistic in life. He also trashes this concept that you see billionaires get on stage and tell people to follow their passion. He points out, somewhat accurately, that most billionaires end up making their billions in very unsexy fields, and then once they've basically attained billionaire-like statuses, they like to travel around the world and tell everybody to follow their passion. Now, nothing Scott says, by his own admission, is rocket science. There's a lot of things that are fairly obvious, either with experience and age and wisdom, or once somebody points it out to you. He's absolutely right as a former entrepreneur that to attain truly large amounts of wealth, you can really only accomplish that either if you inherit it or through equity. There's nothing really that shocking out of it. But what's more interesting, and this is something that I've long suspected, is more money does not necessarily lead to more happiness. Yes, of course, up to a certain amount of wealth, you do get incremental units of happiness, if you could even measure that. But at a certain point, Biggie Smalls was right, more money just translates into more problems. Scott's book is really broken into three different areas: wealth, money, career, health, well-being, and then I would say relationships that include not just, love relationships, but also that with siblings and parents. As mentioned, there's a lot of obvious advice in this book, but things that when you hear, you nod along and you kind of decide to reinforce and maybe apply and stick to more in your life. For one, he's absolutely right that generally speaking, all factors being equal, if you have somebody who basically doesn't do any exercise but simply watches his favorite sports team lose, possibly while drinking alcoholic beverages, and is frustrated on that front, then they are probably going to take that out on their family at the office. And he's kind of right. One of the best decisions I made years ago was when I decided to put the remote control down and frankly not care about how bad the Montreal Canadiens were playing and just started to spend all of that time playing sports again myself. And again, not rocket science, some of the best anger and stress management comes from forgetting whatever it is that's bothering you and just sweating a little bit and partaking in exercise like that. He also accurately points out that one of the most common sources of discontent and unhappiness is substance abuse. He focuses on alcohol, and I tend to agree that basically we live in this culture where professionally and coming out of school, alcohol is omnipresent. You can't really go to an event where alcohol is not present, and whereas he in his presentation explained that he is a better version of himself when he drinks, to be determined if you know Scott, he is spot on that all alcohol does really is just adds this level of, element in your life that probably without it, you would end up being happier on a day-to-day basis. So there's a lot of other stuff when it comes to health and state of your mind that are interesting. Again, nothing that is deep, psychological or biological, but just a lot of common sense stuff. Switching gears into the third bucket, which is relationships, he's absolutely right that the most important decision an individual makes is who their spouse is. I tend to agree. I started this company with my wife, and there's no way that I would have been able to survive and have success if I wasn't in sync with my current wife, Christine. Now, the interesting thing is, again, he cites a lot of examples in his world, which is, Manhattan and New York, where he goes, a lot of my friends are really, really successful bankers, lawyers, executives, and they have this wife who they adore and love, but the wife is basically just a trophy wife, so to speak. And they're not necessarily in sync with their partner, and that creates some kind of friction or divergence as they get older. And I find that to be very astute, that if you are not in sync with your partner, then it's almost impossible to have success in any other domain. The other thing that he points out, which is, again, just very accurate, is that the number one destroyer of your wealth is actually not blowing it on gambling or anything like that, but it is actually divorce. That divorce sets you back quite a bit financially, and sometimes somebody who wants to, come back from that, they never get back to where they were, and that trajectory between the kind of compound effect of interest on your savings just disappears if you have this crazy lavish lifestyle and or eventually get a divorce. So I mentioned that when it comes to the relationship bucket, he also talks a lot about children and parents, and admittedly there are some things that I don't yet identify with, like when it comes to his observation to give somebody who is dying a good death, which when you read sounds really strange. But as I was reading it, I did tend to think of my grandmother who passed away when I was in my early mid-20s. And at the time, I myself didn't really have the means to help. But when I think back and I kind of look back and realize that, in the last stages of her life, she was pretty alone. And when Scott talks about, his mother passing and his relationship with his father and his siblings, you do kind of start to realize that if at the end of the day, your loved ones are in the twilight years of their life, the kind of life that you give them as they are, for lack of a better word, on their way out will mean far more than the car you drive or the vacations that you take. And these are things that as a 41-year-old, I'm hoping not to have to deal with anytime soon with my parents. But it's something that as you kind of take stock of what's really important in life, you start to nod along and you're like, yeah, I see where he's going with that. And as a father of 2 young girls, we talk a lot these days about toxic masculinity. So imagine the setting, we're at some investment banking conference and there's, let's say, 90% men in the room, and Scott's on stage and he's basically talking about how, toxic masculinity may be a bad thing, but, being a man is a wonderful thing. But we find ourselves in society at a time where, holding hands with your kids or kissing your kids, and just even hugging fellow men is kind of frowned upon, and we are cast in these roles and stereotypes. And so Scott also talks a lot about just the importance of, physical proximity with loved ones. Again, all things that are very, very obvious, but he breaks down into these kind of witty anecdotes that you kind of read and you just nod along. Like he mentions how if you ever go out with your wife for supper, dinner, he's like, make sure that you always have some kind of sweater, because if your wife is cold, it doesn't matter what you're eating and how good of a mood she is in. Otherwise, you're having dinner with Satan, not your wife, the cold wind. He also actually points out very accurately that you should never have a discussion when either of you are hungry, because it doesn't matter what points you are making, you're both basically going to be batshit crazy and get into a fight. So again, these are things that are not rocket science, but that we forget and we overlook, and it's a pretty quick read. I read this in 2 nights, super tired after a lot of travel, but I just breezed through it, and I really was thinking that this is a book you should read really young in your life, because it will help you just make better decisions and surround yourself much sooner.